lives. Stories. Thanks, Emily. It's okay. Share short stories. And so what it does is it allows you to reference objects that have been important in your life and your own sort of knowledge and explore those things and share those with others. So when you go to our website, you're going to notice a few tabs at the top. The first is virtual exhibits. So this is a good place to start if you're interested in learning about a particular topic. Currently, we have several Wisconsin 101 exhibitions, which are online exhibits organized by topics and featuring objects and stories that our contributors have written. At the top, you'll notice the subjects are listed, so they're easy to navigate, easy to find. So for instance, we have one on becoming the dairy state, which if you were to click into, you'll find all sorts of stories written on the history of dairy in Wisconsin. The second type of exhibition or exhibit that we have are museum mini tours. And these are done in partnership with the Wisconsin Historical Museum, Old World Wisconsin, and the Wade House. So these are objects were you to visit the museum, you would recognize as part of the museum's collection. So if we were to click on the Wisconsin Historical Museum mini tour, we can go through and see the objects that we have here on Wisconsin 101. Stories that people have written about these objects that also tie into the collection at the Historical Museum. Some of these are actually written by contributors, but are actually written by curators at the Historical Museum as well. Most importantly, under our Histories tab, we have the object collection. So objects are really at the heart of Wisconsin 101. They're all listed object history, and say we wanted to learn about an object, the Lapham Peak Observation Tower. All of these stories then connect to other stories. And so it's really fun to be able to see something that catches your eye and then read more on it and see how it connects with other stories. For instance, this is a story that one of our interns wrote, a undergraduate student, and he was very interested in this tower that was in his hometown. So he decided to do some research on it, and it ended up taking him down all these interesting roads, and he ended up learning a lot about the WPA and also about the founding of the National Weather Bureau. We also provide resources for teachers to be able to use in their classrooms, and that would be under for educators. This is content that include lesson plans and class ideas for projects in ways that students can use the website to learn more about Wisconsin history. So with that very brief introduction of the layout of the website, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to talk a little bit about how this project began.
Thanks, Courtney. The beginnings of Wisconsin 101 are more or less to be traced back to 2013. At the time, Emily, the introduction Emily gave me was not quite accurate. I wasn't at the time in the history department. And in fact, I never was in the history department. At the time, I was in the history of science department, which at that moment was a separate department in Madison. It's since been dissolved and all the people in the history of science department have moved into history. But at the time, although I knew many people in the history department, I didn't know Sarah Thal at the time, who became my partner on this. And just a second, that'll get picked up. We met in a hiring committee, and we began talking about a problem that was very prevalent at the time, which is that the teaching of history was under attack, both in Wisconsin and nationally, for being kind of useless. And students should come to school only to study technical subjects. And if you weren't learning something for a job, then why study it at all? And this kind of language, it's still pretty common today, but it was especially common 7 to 10 years ago. And we wanted to find a way to counteract that. And so we began thinking about, and at the time too, enrollments in history were declining at both at Wisconsin and really everywhere. And we wanted to kind of give students, undergraduates, a sense of why history is worth studying. And one way to do that is to show that it has greater public resonances. Um, and and um, and that means, for example, that you could see a value to your writing in history beyond simply a 12-page paper that you wrote for the end of the semester that you then threw away after the semester was over. And so we wanted to give students a chance to sort of do work that would get them outside of history. And so that's partly where the idea came from. Another place it came from, I guess I have share screen too, don't I, Courtney? Yeah. Whoops, let me share my screen for just a moment. Can I, Courtney? Okay. Yes, I'm gonna stop your sharing for just a moment, because I want to show you that another inspiration for the project was this project from the British Museum, which very well-known project that came out in 2010 called "The History of the World in 100 Objects." This project began as a exhibit in the British Museum in London. They basically went through their, went through their basement and came up with 100 things. But they used it to tell a sort of comprehensive history of the world. And what was especially impressive about this project was each of the objects was made the subject of a 15-minute special podcast that was then produced by BBC4, one of the domestic radio services in the UK. And so, for example, here I'm just showing you, highlighting here, a pen that was faced by in service of the suffragette movement in the early 20th century. And what you see is this penny, this 1 pence coin, on which someone had stamped "votes for women" as a way of sort of popularizing that. So all of these objects were used to tell stories about both not just British history, but mostly world history. Okay, you can take back the screen if you want, Courtney. We were inspired by this, but we wanted to do something that was obviously Wisconsin based. And we especially wanted to get the students to use object histories to write local history, right? So one of the things that you'll see in museums is that objects in museums are not necessarily connected with the locality. They may be in the museum because they're rare, because they're interesting in their own right, but they don't always have a direct connection to a place. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to really use the objects to tell stories about a part of Wisconsin. And that means in many cases that the objects are essentially, many of the objects on our website are manufactured items. And that's because everything that's made by a manufacturer is made somewhere, right? There's a specific place that the object is associated with. One of our, well, pull up the Penguin server, would you, Courtney? And then we'll go to did you get the Kohler pages? But let's go look at the
Yes, I
Penguin.
did.
Yeah, let's look at the Penguin server for a moment. One of the most well-known objects on the website is the West Bend Penguin server. And one of the reasons why the Penguin server is such a good object is that it was made by the West Bend Company right after World War II, when West Bend was transitioning from wartime production using aluminum back to consumer products that they had been known for even before the war began. So the object itself is very well connected with West Bend, the town of West Bend. But more than that, the person who wrote the story did a wonderful job of showing why this particular object tells us so much about American society in the 1940s and 50s. It turns out the West Bend Penguin server was perfect for bringing out, little Oscar Mayer wieners in baked beans or Jello salads. You could use it for both hot and cold things because it was insulated. And so it was useful for outdoor barbecues, which was a big fad after World War II, or you could use it for cocktail parties to carry the ice around. So this object is a nice indicator both of what was going on locally in West Bend, but also what was going on nationally in the United States. And I'll just give you one other example of how you can use an object this way. And that's a couple of stories I just finished about the Kohler Company. Now, Kohler is a story that I've wanted to write for some time because, like West Bend Corporation, really more like Harley Davidson, Kohler is an iconic Wisconsin name. It is one of the most famous Wisconsin companies. The picture here is of a toilet that was featured in Kohler's catalog in 1914. It was called the Armada toilet. They named their toilets. And there's so many interesting things about Kohler. I would go far too long in telling you about them, but I'm just going to give you a couple. Kohler began when John Michael Kohler decided to branch out as from his normal business of making agricultural implements or horse troughs. And he began wanting to enter the household appliances business. But to do that, he was actually depending upon, scroll down just a little bit. He was depending upon actually work done by his father-in-law, Jacob Fulrat, who also owned a foundry. They began in Sheboygan. And Fulrat also wanted to get into housewares. And whereas Kohler was interested in housewares for bathrooms, Fulrat was interested in housewares for kitchens. And so he started trying to produce enamelware, enameled tea kettles, enameled cooking pots, but they couldn't get the process right because enameling is complicated. It's a messy, highly complicated process, requires a lot of skill. So Fulrat dispatched his son to Germany to steal secrets of enameling. Andrew Fulrat, the son, brought them back, helped the Fulrat company enter business in kitchenware, and also helped the Kohler Company enter business in enameled bathroomware, especially bathtubs in the beginning. Kohler then enters this market of offering bathroom appliances, and it's exploding. It's exploding rapidly because at the time, let's switch to the second one. In the late 1800s, bathrooms themselves were a new site, a new space in American households. Prior to the middle of the 19th century, the bathroom that we know it didn't exist. And so it was at the time that these appliances were being gathered in the same space. And the bathrooms always had, and actually mostly still have, bathtub, sink, and toilet. All of them were gathered together. And in the housing boom of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the business of Kohler just exploded in terms of its very rapid growth as Kohler became one of the leading suppliers of fixtures for this new space in the house, the bathroom. And you can tell from these and other ads, Kohler just was able to market the bathroom as this cool space where rising middle class people just want to get the best stuff. And even in the early 20th century, this ad I think is from 1916, already Kohler was really at the forefront of offering bathroom appliances as the mark of a modern middle class household. It's really quite an impressive story. I finished 2 of the 3 stories that are here. The last story I want to tell is about the village of Kohler, which itself is also a really interesting story. And associated with the village of Kohler are the 2 really bitter strikes that overtook the Kohler Company, one in the 1930s and one in the 1950s. So Kohler's story is really complicated because on the one hand, Kohler wanted to create this ideal space for its workers, this village where the workers of the company could live right next to the factory. And on the other hand, that that kind of communal relationship between the owners of the and Kohler, by the way, is still a privately owned company. It doesn't have any stock. It's entirely owned by the Kohler family. Um, the peaceful communal aspect of the village was disrupted by these two very bitter strikes that overtook the factory. So I want to tell something about that story too. So that's the sort of thing you can do. The toilet is both an object, and by the way, toilets are not cast iron. They're actually pottery. They're a form of pottery, right? You pour porcelain into a mold, you dry it, you bake it, you glaze it. It's sort of like the pots you made in 5th grade, except it's a toilet. And so Kohler uses both pottery technology and enameling and foundry work to make its kitchen products, to make its bathroom products. So that's the kind of stuff you can do with object history.
Great, thank you. So I guess a question I would ask is for folks who might be interested in contributing to Wisconsin 101, how did you first come upon the idea to choose Kohler and even choose the toilet to be the object that you kind of build your story around?
Right. Objects are great. Objects usually are good. Okay, I knew I wanted to write about Kohler. And because Kohler has such an interesting, actually, I can tell you just a little story. When I was in graduate school, Emily mentioned that I was a graduate student at Princeton. Well, Lynn Neihart, my wife, who was in grad school with me, was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. And one of her professors at the University of Pennsylvania was a very prominent historian of science named Robert Kohler. Rob Kohler is, in fact, the grandson of Walter Kohler Sr., who was a governor of Wisconsin. And he is the great-grandson of John Michael Kohler, the founder of the company. So I already knew something about Kohler from having gotten to know Rob Kohler over many years. But Kohler, anybody who knows anything about Wisconsin knows Kohler. And what I found so interesting about Kohler is the complicated story. And remember, once you've got a manufacturer, if they make something, it's kind of a gimme that their object is something good to focus on. It could have been a bathtub, it could have been a toilet, could have been a sink, except sinks aren't very interesting. The other thing that made me want to write about a toilet is I'd like to do a story about Kohler for Wisconsin Life and use a flushing toilet as a sound effect for it. So that was also a reason I wanted to write about it. But I knew I wanted to write about Kohler, and then it was just a matter of finding an object to use. And in some ways, the object is, in this case, slightly less interesting in its own right, except if you want to learn something about bathrooms. And who doesn't want to know about bathrooms? So
Yeah, there's something we all live
yeah,
with.
we don't avoid them.
We can all relate to.
Right.
So I think this question is really important because if you were to say like, oh, I'm really interested in doing this, one of the most difficult things could sometimes be to choose the right object. And or to choose a topic. And so one of the first things that you probably want to do is to sort of mine your own interests and things that you know and things that have piqued your interest in the past and explore those things. That can be something super simple through searches on Google. Or you can even go to there are certain resources out there that are really great starting points. Such as the Wisconsin Historical Society's collections. And so if you were to go to Wisconsin History, and you can do a collection search and just see what's out there, see what some of the objects that they have, see if something piques your interest. Usually these objects, if you're to choose an object from the collections, a lot of times they'll have some text with them. That's a good starting point, and will give you keywords and whatnot to work with. They also have these sorts of, I'm looking right now through their online exhibits that you can explore. You can explore the museum collections. Curators' favorites are also, objects that they have at the museum that are also good starting points. You can search by subject matter. You can also search on our website on Wisconsin 101 if you're unsure about where to get started. You can also look at some of the objects that we have available that we're interested in telling stories about. For instance, of course, the Neenah Foundry manhole cover is one that we're all so familiar. We see it anywhere you go, you see the Neenah Foundry Company sign. And so this is an object that has is like the toilet, right? It's a sort of manufactured object that has really strong roots here in Wisconsin. And so we would love a story about something like that, for instance. But aside from, sort of starting with an object and beginning your research in that direction, another way to figure out what sort of object or an object is to start with the subject. Start with looking through newspapers on newspapers.com and searching for words that are of interest to you. And going at it from that direction instead, and then seeing, what is an object that I can then use to tell the story. And that's sort of the direction that you went, Tom, with the Kohler story. You didn't necessarily start off knowing I'm going to write about a toilet. It was more like, I've got this interest in the Kohler Company, and I know there's a lot going on there. I want to learn more. And then that object becomes sort of the touchstone of telling that story.
Well, and the thing I discovered in particular was so I'm a historian of medicine, and I taught history of medicine in Madison for 30 years. So I knew about the history of public health in the 19th century, but I didn't really know about the role of public health and the importance of providing sewers in cities in the creation of bathrooms. That's right. I knew that indoor plumbing, was part of that story, but the bathroom as this particular space I discovered in a book that was published in 2018. And that's what really clicked that part of the story. So by reading around, I was able to associate my interest in toilets and Kohler with the emergence of bathrooms. I mean, it's not that difficult a story, right? Because Kohler makes a big deal out of itself as a bathroom furnisher, but there's a good story about bathrooms. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's so much about choosing that object or coming upon a subject is a bit of a treasure hunt. It's an exploration. It's being curious and seeing where things lead you.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, of course.
One thing I've recommended to students sometimes is that they get a hold. I mean, this was easier in the days when you could go to the Historical Society and look through their very large microfilm collection.
Yeah.
If you just start riffing through an old newspaper, there's so many interesting things you discover by just looking through 6 months of it. What are these people into? What are they doing? What sorts of things are they working with? It is literally, you're just presented with all sorts of strange things that are potential topics. And that's a wonderful way to discover something you're interested in, is just kind of browse through some old stuff. And newspapers are great for that. Old magazines are good too, if you can get your hands on them. Saturday Evening Post, Life magazine,
Yeah.
stuff like that. I mean, it gives you a limited slice because those tend to be, white middle-class audiences and stuff. But nevertheless, you get access to a lot of interesting stuff by looking at that.
Yeah, it reminds me, I was doing some research and I was looking through some newspapers based up in Rudolph, Wisconsin. And a lot of times the advertisements push locality with with the businesses, with what they're making. They'll be like, the town with fill in the blank. And so there's so many discoveries to be made by looking through those old newspapers. You're absolutely right.
That boosterism is really common, and it was satirized by Sinclair Lewis in his novel Babbitt, which is sort of all about the boosterism of a small town. Yeah, so I mean that, he wasn't writing in empty air there. He's writing to satirize something that was extremely common. It's exactly the thing you're talking about.
So it kind of circles back to, for the mission of Wisconsin 101 is to tell stories that are rooted in Wisconsin, objects that are rooted in Wisconsin. And so we've kind of touched that the most obvious one is these manufactured objects. It's very obvious connection. I mean, another one would be the aluminum trees, the evergreen trees, and they do an exhibition of these like every year at the Historical Museum, I think. But it's not necessarily things that were mass produced. They can be objects that were handmade. They can be, they can be, a monument of sort. They can be an object that was made for household use. They can be all sorts of things, Some of the issues, some of the topics to get sort of like the wheels turning that we're really interested in growing on our site are Wisconsin's brewing history. There's tons of opportunity to write stories about that here. Civil rights in Wisconsin. You can think of posters, you can think of, objects that people might wear that might connect with civil rights, the conservation movement, of course, the American Indian movement, labor history. Labor history really relates, I think, to the Kohler story really beautifully as well, in thinking about, other objects that can help tell that story, like pins or sort of protest signs, things like these that help us better understand a topic of interest. So when you sort of have done a little bit of research and you say, oh, I've got this idea, and I've got an object that I think that connects with it in some way, then you'd want to start thinking about submitting a proposal to us. And so your proposal for your idea comes in essentially two parts. The first part is an object history. So I've got this object, I've got a Kohler toilet, and I want to write about this, about the Kohler Company. So the object history is going to be looking at the toilet. You're going to ask questions like, what is it made out of? How is it made? Who made it? When was it made? How do you use it? A lot of questions that you're asking that object to tell you a little bit about itself, how it was made, how it was used. The second part is a related story. And so that's what we were sort of looking at with Tom's objects, and thinking about how does this object then relate to public health and the development of the sort of home bathroom. And so that's where you're able to get into a little bit more nitty gritty about the topic that you're interested in. With the related story, you might want to think about questions like, how did this technology impact the development of this object, the production of this object? You might ask, how did it affect the community having this business there or whatnot? It might be asking questions about, who were the people that produced this object? That might be, a business, as we've talked about, but it might also just be a person or a group of people or a culture of people living and working in Wisconsin. It might be coming out of a very specific region. You can ask questions like, how did this, connect with bigger stories that people are perhaps familiar with? How does it connect with a person's lifestyle? And so some of these ideas we go through and spell out in the submission guidelines, where we talk about the two parts, which again are the object description and a related history, and give you some parameters to get started, to start putting together the story that you want to tell. So for related history, you're really able to think about how this object relates to Wisconsin, what the impact was, and think about the significance of the object and the people that used it, the companies that used it. When we've thought a little bit about what are good objects, but I think it's also important to recognize what might not be good objects too. What should you not choose if you're thinking about writing? You want to avoid things that are really kind of loosely connected, maybe with like a famous person or something. Like this book was probably used by fill in the blank famous person. That's not necessarily having the kind of connection to Wisconsin. That it's not a very strong connection to a place. It's not a very strong connection to a community or a locality. So while there might be these sorts of what we might call like a numinous object, like Abe Lincoln's hat being famous because Abe Lincoln wore it, it's not necessarily a good object for telling a Wisconsin story. Other things that are a little tough would be using like a text or a newspaper itself as that object that you're using to tell the story. That's really going to be the sources that you're going to use to discover your story and to discover your object, more than being the object itself. There is a little bit of wiggle room with that though. So I've got one object that I'd like to show you. And it is a cookbook. So this cookbook has a pretty strong connection to Wisconsin, particularly to Milwaukee. But it also is connected to Wisconsin because of who wrote it. And so there are a couple things going on here. You have a kind of articulation of lifestyle by a Wisconsinite, and it's produced in Wisconsin. And so the connections there are nice and tight, as opposed to something that may have been produced elsewhere and used by a Wisconsinite, if that makes sense. You'll notice on our website that we have that our entries are relatively short. We do produce content, online content to be effective typically is pretty short. So we're not looking at really, really long pieces or anything like that. In terms of the sort of practical things that you would need to know as a contributor, your object histories would be about 250, 300 words, it's about a page in length. And then the related histories are a little bit longer. You're looking at about 2 pages in length. And the reason is that we want to share stories, but we also understand that when you're writing stories for folks who are searching online, that we tend to only read so much and then we want on to the next thing. And so that's part of the nature of breaking your interests into smaller pieces and encouraging people to click through and explore and learn more about that topic. And so they might, the ways in that they can explore that topic and all the related topics on our website are essentially then endless. It keeps people clicking, it keeps people engaged, which is a really fundamental principle of building really engaging educational websites. So if you were to have any questions, of course, this is a great place to reference, to look at and to get ideas from. But of course, you can always contact us as well when, through the writing and research process. We also invite people to work in groups together and to perhaps come up with a theme of stories that you would be interested in telling together. So the project has a lot of opportunity to be collaborative. At this point, I would love to open it up to any questions that you might have, to any comments that we might have from Emily or Tom, anything that I may have missed.
No, I think you covered everything pretty well, Courtney. Thanks. Do our listeners have any questions or anything they'd like to ask about?
Hey, hi guys. Sorry we were lurking. I was cooking dinner at the start and then we were eating dinner. I didn't think I wanted to
It's a sort of dinner theater, right? So yeah.
We
Yeah.
really enjoyed the presentation and our two children have as well. David and I were both undergraduate students in the Department of History at UW-Madison, and we love history, and this has been really, really interesting. Do you have any questions?
No, I love the story about West Bend and Kohler. Those were great.
Oh,
and now we've been sitting here talking about what object could we come up with and
Where do you live now, and where were you from? Are you from Wisconsin originally?
Both of us are. We live here in Madison. We live in Shorewood Hills now. I grew up in Marshfield, right in the middle of the state, and David actually grew up very near West Bend.
Yeah, in Slinger, which is very near.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah, it's funny, we don't have many objects from Madison. And one reason for that was kind of political, which is we wanted, one of the problems, if you're from Wisconsin, you know that the difficulties of the political geography of the state, right? So there's this tendency that Madison uses all of its own resources to sort of celebrate itself. And one person, when I was going around very early on giving talks about this, someone I was talking to somewhere else in the state said, well, why don't you guys just do this in Madison? You could write one object for every county. You've got all the resources there at the State Historical Society and the Historical Society Library. And my answer was, because nobody would be interested in that. Something produced in Madison that was then sprinkled out over the rest of the state would be not very interesting. So we tend to downplay the Madison part of it because we don't want this to be about Madison. We want it to be about mostly pretty much everywhere but Madison. But were there to ever be an object of interest from Madison? I mean, I lived in Madison for 30 years and I'll be damned if I can find something interesting there, but who knows, maybe I'm just not looking in the right places. But
I'm curious if you guys have anything from the Northwoods. My family has land on a lake and a cottage that my grandfather bought in the 50s, and there's a really interesting. Well, there's a lot of history, that logging and stuff, but then the subsequent tourism history there. Do you guys have anything from up in that area?
We do. Well, that's somewhat of an exception. Let me look for, there's the bark spud, and there's from Taylor County, and there's actually 3 objects from Antigo, all related, 2 of them related to the lumber industry. One of my favorite objects from Antigo is the Vulcan Lumber Company's bowling pin. And that was done by Joe Hermelin, who's used to work at UW-Madison and then retired up and became a volunteer with the Langlade County Historical Society. And so he wrote this wonderful set of stories about the Vulcan bowling pin as one of the sort of companies made out of maple. And then he talked about the growth of bowling for a number of years. The headquarters of the Professional Bowling Association was in Milwaukee. Milwaukee was like the epicenter of bowling. So that was a great story, and it was based upon the lumber industry. And then show them the bark spud. This one comes from Taylor County, if I'm not mistaken. And the bark spud was no, that's too far west. It's over in that other cluster in the north central part of the state. Nah, that's Wausau.
To Wausau.
Yeah. Can you search it by the object instead of just scroll through the objects? So the reason, there it is. The reason why the bark spud is interesting is hemlock is a tree that has a great deal of tannin in its bark. And so one of the value of hemlock logs was not just for the wood, but you could scrape the bark off the tree and then use it in tanning, right? In preparing hides for, and so, and it's special to hemlock. It can't be done with other trees that grow in the northern forest. So you got this sort of side industry growing up alongside the regular logging industry, specifically for hemlock. And of course, it wasn't unique to Wisconsin. And this isn't actually what this story is good for. The two, I can't remember the name of the two sisters who produced this story. They're sort of local historians of Taylor County. Although the bark spud itself isn't really about that place, it's everywhere in the North Woods would have the same, excuse me, everywhere in the North Woods with hemlock would have the same quality. So there's nothing unique about Taylor County here, but they did a very nice job of showing you which businesses in Taylor County were involved in tanning. So they brought it, they made it nice and local by talking about which businesses actually practiced it. I don't think we have anything else from the North Woods.
Not a ton. Yeah, the
Yeah.
map is gets pretty sparse up there, unfortunately.
Yeah, we've got objects from Wausau. We've got the from fox fur coat, and we've got the audiometer produced by Employers Insurance, but that's not really about the North Woods. That's really about workman's compensation.
Right.
But yeah, so there's you know, if you're ever inspired to do a story. A former undergraduate who worked with me on writing the story of the duck decoy from down in Lake Koshkonong area in the south. She did an internship at the Eagle River Historical Society, and she promised an object from them, but she hasn't been able to produce it yet. So there it is. That's a really cool story because Lake Koshkonong, it's a kind of environmental history of this area, which is at the center of various Native American groups. And eventually, by the late 19th century, Lake Koshkonong became this place that hunters would come up from Chicago. Commercial hunters would come up from Chicago and shoot ducks and then haul them back down to Chicago for the meatpacking industry. So it's a very nice story about that part of southeastern Wisconsin. Yeah, Lauren she did. I should bug her. I should write her and bug her. I wonder if she still got the same email. One of the things about contributors is you have to bug them about. Well, it took me a year.
What else are you gonna write?
Yeah, so who am I to complain? It took me forever to write the Kohler stuff. So.
Do you have some connections with the Northwoods, or just a curiosity?
Our connection is just that my grandparents, and there's a little bit of a myth around, so he was a professor of history actually at University of Wisconsin, River Falls. And in the late 50s, they found what he called the Shangri-La, which was a little dumpy cabin on a lake in the Northwoods. And so there's sort of a mythology around them finding it. And my grandmother famously said, "This is the place," quoting, who's the Mormon guy?
Oh, John.
Brigham Young, who said that?
Yeah, it was Brigham Young who said, "Yeah, we're going to settle in this desert." I think it was Brigham Young who said, "Right, that's where we're going to go." Yeah. Yeah.
But so I guess for 4 generations of my family, we have a pretty close connection to that area. And,
where's it near?
It's north of Spooner.
Ah, well, not that far from Hayward.
Right.
Where my grandfather had a place.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And he died when I was only 5 years old. So I never really, I vaguely remember going up there once, but my older brother, who's 7.5 years older than I am, remembers it really well. And yeah, what's funny is that when my grandfather died, my father, and especially my father, but his 2 sisters, wanted to sell it in part because they could already see it filling up. And this was in 1960s. You can imagine what these places look like now with, a 40-foot strip, sort of the entire lake carved up.
Right. Yeah, and I think the tourism up there, you know, is quite different than it was. I mean,
Yeah.
I've met folks who came up as kids. You know, they're now in their 60s, 70s, 80s, but they came up and spent the summer at a resort, or you know, a month at the resort. Dad stayed in Chicago or Beloit and worked. Sometimes came up on the weekends. Mom and the kids were kind of spent the summer there. It's just kind of an interesting. For families that could afford it, it was an interesting.
It's so much more accessible, right? So when my father was a kid, he used to drive up from, he grew up in Evanston, and the family had to drive up old US 12 right through Madison. In fact, when we first bought our house in Madison in University Heights, they drove about 2 blocks on Old University. That was US 12. And he was shocked to see that Lombardino's, you know, still looked like it did, you know, 50 years ago. But anyway, it's so much more accessible now. And the highways that have opened up the north have just made it that much easier for everyone from Chicago to just sort of flood up there. And that's really obvious. It used to take, I was a camp counselor for 2 summers in Minocqua area. And it used to take forever to drive up there. Once you got north of Stevens Point, it was a 2-lane road. And I mean, it just took forever. Now it's 4-lane all the way up to Minocqua. It doesn't take any time at all. And that's kind of, I think, typical of a lot of the areas in the north.
Yeah, I think I think it's a really interesting story that, I mean, let me know what you think, but I mean, it's something that the Historical Society has a whole sort of corner on tourism at this time, sort of like the mobility of middle-class families in, say, like 40s and 50s coming up on their weekend vacations. It's definitely a story that we don't have, and it's definitely a story that there are resources for. And so if you
Show
are
them the Cherryland t-shirt.
Oh yeah.
There is one tourism related story, and it's not about the North Woods, it's about Door County, but this was a t-shirt that that was produced as a way of marketing tourism in Door County. I think it was in the 1940s or 50s that this t-shirt first appeared. So yeah, to me, when the t-shirt was first proposed, I thought, a t-shirt? That's not a very interesting object, but the stories around the t-shirt are plenty interesting. And it was also about the use of migrant workers to pick cherries, right? So it's a complicated story, right? Because on the one hand, the economic basis of Door County was fruit, but they also were seeking to develop using migrant labor. And then they were also seeking to develop the tourism. So there's lots of cool stuff like that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other questions? It's been about an hour.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? I noticed that there's the HBC code. I'm in Canada, and here HBC is like iconic as for a trading company, the department store that continues. What's the Wisconsin connection for the HBC code?
Yeah, that's from the museum. And it was, so that particular, that HBC is Hudson's Bay Company, in case you guys don't know. To be honest, I don't know. It's a pattern that was widely traded in the North Woods. And it's the reason why this particular object is here is that it's features on the tour that the museum docents give to 4th grade classes. So they wanted to have this coat there as a way of sort of allowing teachers to follow up on objects the kids saw. It's not because it actually has a nice local connection with anywhere in Wisconsin. So we made some exceptions to some of our usual posting rules to sort of accommodate especially stuff in Old World Wisconsin and in the State Historical Museum to accommodate their tours. On the other hand, if you look at the stuff on Wade House, which is a really interesting place to go visit if you guys have a chance sometime, it's between Fond du Lac and Sheboygan. Those are really, we chose objects that really told you something about the Wade House, right? So as opposed to these objects, which are kind of generic objects, like this stupid pasty that's on the tour there, and the Hudson's Bay pattern coat. Yeah, the Wade House stuff is much more specific. So, yeah.
In that one, we don't have tons of objects from the Wade House either. And I mean, there's also potential there where, would you be
Yeah.
curious in telling those stories?
Or other state historical sites, right? So
exactly, yes.
That's, yeah. Actually, we designed those essentially as a bit of a mini tour, not to help, again, people doing school tours of the Wade House. So anyway.
Any other questions? Any other comments, remarks? Everybody ready to, be inspired and
Yeah,
become authors for Wisconsin 101? Great.
All right. Well, maybe we should call it
Yeah.
a day. And thanks for.
So much.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Everybody.
It's really, yeah, it's
Thanks
really
so
nice
much,
talking with you.
Courtney and Tom.
Yeah. Oh, our pleasure. All right.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah. See you. Good night.
All right.
Bye.
Good night.
All right.